The builder generation was a generation of caution. The baby boomer generation, a generation of confidence. Xers, back to caution. Millennials, back to confidence. Gen Z, back to caution. It's like a pendulum swinging back and forth on the grandfather clock of history.
Have you ever thought about how major historical events and trends influence the perspectives of those you lead and, therefore, impact the best ways to lead them? I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from Dr. Tim Elmore, founder and CEO of Growing Leaders, an organization dedicated to developing young, emerging leaders. Dr. Elmore has written 35 books, that's right, 35, including his well-known series called Habitudes, which utilizes captivating and meaningful pictures to teach timeless truths about leadership. He is known across the United States and has traveled to locations around the world, sharing his insights. On top of all of that, he has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, USA Today, and Psychology Today, and he's also been featured on TV interviews on CNN and Fox. On a personal note, I've had the privilege of knowing Dr. Elmore for 20 years. He has an amazing combination of knowledge, humility, and encouragement that has blessed me personally and professionally. As you listen to him, know that he is not only knowledgeable, he is also a practitioner of leadership. He applies the very principles he shares with others. But before we get into Dr. Elmore's wisdom and the details of his most recent book, we get a chance to hear about those who have influenced him, which includes a faked illness that put him in front of a crowd for the very first time, and a 20-year stint working directly for a giant in the world of leadership development.
Mom and Dad were huge. I have equal DNA from my mother and my father. That was kind of cool because I think I got some good stuff from both. But I would say, Tim, one of the early influences that people may or may not know is a guy named Sean Mitchell. Sean was the chaplain for the San Diego Chargers. I met him when I was a teenager in high school. He was in his 20s, and this would have been, 50 years ago. Maybe not 50 years ago, 45 years ago. So I'm old. I'm a dinosaur. But Sean made a huge impression on me with his passion. I didn't meet anybody with the same level of passion, and it was magnetic to me as a teen. But Tim, he's the one I think I've told you about that got me up in front of a crowd speaking at 17 years old before I thought I was ready. And I found out later he faked laryngitis in order to get me up in front of this crowd. And of course, I want to hit him, when I remember that story. But it was so cool that his value that night when I spoke was not get the best speaker up. If that was the goal, he would have been up. It was, I see this young guy and I want to start grooming him for what I see inside, communication skills and leadership skills. It was not only my first time up, but from that point on, he hugged me afterwards. He was a big old football player. And he said, Tim, from now on, we'll rotate. I'll be on one week, you'll be on the next. So on a regular basis, since I was 17 years old, I've been communicating. The other one I would mention real quick here is John Maxwell. I went on staff with John Maxwell right out of college. So it was the early 80s. John wasn't yet really famous. So I had lots of just personal time. He was in his 30s. I was in my 20s. And I just cannot calculate how valuable that was. He wasn't perfect, but he nailed what it meant to lead well. And I got that in me, in my 20s. And I'm in my early 60s now.
Many of our listeners are familiar with John and his work. And just imagine, here is one of the most well-known and accomplished developer of leaders on the planet. And in your 20s, you started a 20-year tutelage underneath him. And I appreciate what you're saying. He's not perfect. Nobody is. But what a unexpected gift. You probably didn't know that when you said, yes, I'm going to join in here with John Maxwell.
I didn't. In fact, people ask that question all the time. I didn't know. I just knew he had a level of charisma for sure. He's always had that. And he took a keen interest in me, which every mentee will say, well, the reason he mentored me is because he was interested in me. But I mean, he took me under his wing and I made mistakes and he didn't fire me. And so by the time I get to midlife, I start this nonprofit, Growing Leaders, which really was repurposing John's leadership development for adults. I wanted to do it for the next gen.
Yeah.
So young adults and
Wow.
teenagers. So it was, I always tell him every time I'm with him, I hug him and I go, you got stock in all the work I'm doing right now. And he always smiles and says, all right, I'll take it, you know?
How special it is. I mean, if there's this kind of classic moment where people get a chance, you hear this story all the time. They get a chance to meet their hero and it's a disappointment. They get a chance to be closer to the person they've been observing from afar, and
Yeah,
it's not a fulfilling and encouraging thing. And here you're telling a story about somebody who writes and speaks about leadership at a very high level, and you are the example of him living it out behind the
yeah.
scenes, which is so much more encouraging than the classic story of I was disappointed when I met that person. So that's wonderful.
Well, it was and is. In fact, we're now merging. John approached me in 2021 and said, what do you think about reconnecting our two organizations? So we're in the process of doing that. And that was an honor, of course,
Yeah,
to be the next gen arm of the Maxwell enterprise.
which is a wonderful segue into we want to spend some time talking about today. Now, you heard in the intro that Tim has written 17,422 books. And today,
Yeah.
today we're going to talk about just one of them. We're going to focus in just a touch of hyperbole there, but not that much. I mean, my friend, you have cranked out so much content over the year. But there is this word that has gotten a lot of attention recently, this
Yeah.
word diversity. And you've written a book, a new kind of diversity. And so let's dig into this because I think it's going to be helpful. You're coming at an angle here that not a lot of people talk about. And so let's just start out before we get into the content of the book. What inspired you to write it? Why did you want to dig into this material?
Yeah, it is a good question. I feel like the real impetus was I was seeing an elephant in the room in every organization, company, school I went to. We do talk about ethnic diversity, gender diversity, income diversity. Those are all very real, and we need to keep discussing them and positively changing. However, the elephant in the room was the diversity of generations that are in an organization
Hmm.
that we don't know how to talk about except in sarcasm or stereotypes. We meet at the water cooler and say, millennials, can't live with them, can't live with them, or something like that. Kids today. Have we not said kids today for millenniums? Socrates said, kids in my day are disrespectful to the adults. And I'm going, oh my gosh, that could have been written last week. So anyway, I wrote this book to be sort of an encyclopedia where a leader or really anyone, a team member, an uncle in a family reunion could say, I understand the builder generation, understand the boomers, the Xers, the millennials, Gen Z. And now the new kids on the block are the alpha generation. These are the children, middle school and under, that are gracing planet Earth. And I'm thinking with 7 generations that are alive right now, we better pay attention to this topic.
Well, I'm glad that you wrote it, and I'm glad that we get to talk about it today so that we can shine a light on it and think about both the challenges and the opportunities that
Yeah.
come along with this multi-generational workforce. And I say workforce, it applies to businesses, but it applies to nonprofits and schools and athletics and everything else as well. So let's dig into the content here a little bit. You, in the book, you say this: the generation gap, which was first noticed in the 1960s, has widened today, making collaboration and synergy on a team more challenging than ever. So
Yeah.
say a little bit more, unpack that idea for us a little bit as we begin to dig into this idea around diversity of age and generations.
Well, the reason I made that statement in the book, the gap's gotten wider today. We noticed it way back in the 60s when the baby boomers were the new kids on the block. And it was those older folk that can't understand these hippies, whatever, kids today. But here's why I believe the gap has gotten wider. Probably many reasons, but here's one. The screens in our life went from public to private. So we had one screen in our house when I was a child growing up. It was a black and white TV, but we all gathered around that screen and watched together, laughed together, talked about it together. Today, we all have our own individual screen in our hands. And I can live in a silo, in a niche, if you will,
Hmm.
very different from my parents or my children. So you know, I don't need to elaborate on this, but I'll say this: a parent may have a teenager who, and they know she has an Instagram account, but they have no idea she has 5 Finsta accounts, fake Instagram, where she's
Mm.
developed personas and she is posing to be this and in touch with who knows, God knows who.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying it's just so easy now to be in different worlds. And so the gap just keeps getting bigger and bigger because we're not together like we used to be.
That's really interesting. Just over this weekend, you know that I have a history around college athletics, and so I get sucked
Yeah.
into all the documentaries. And I got sucked into a couple this past weekend, so I ended up binge watching Swamp Kings on Netflix. But right after that, and related to what you're talking about, I got sucked into the untold story around Manti Te'o and the catfishing situation that he went through. And
Yeah.
as I watched that story, I mean, it was a heartbreaking story to watch in so many different ways. Talk about going, generationally. You don't have to go back very far. And everybody's like, what the heck is catfishing? What on earth is, I mean, there's no context for that. And so your point is really well taken. These individual screens really have an impact on how we interact with the world outside of us, how we interact with the
No
people around
doubt.
us, how we interact with ourselves. So boy, I can't imagine anybody listening would disagree with the impact
Yeah.
of these individual screens.
Well, and Tim, the number one thing that happens if we're not careful is we just get frustrated at these huge differences that make colliding easier than collaborating at work. So here's what my goal is in a simple phrase. You know, I'm kind of cheesy, but here's my phrase. I want to turn your frustration into fascination with the other generations. How do they bring a value that I did not have until that 22-year-old showed up? So that's really the goal. It's not just, oh my gosh, now I kind of understand that, Martian that just came on our team. It's more, oh my gosh, thank God for that Martian. He knows TikTok and we can monetize that for marketing here. So
Well, I think your frustration fascination comment is so important because it aligns perfectly with the core leadership principle of being curious.
yeah,
Ultimately,
yes,
this is something that we all as leaders need to be more of. It's, in fact, in our work with our clients, it's the first thing we start with. And the reason that we start with it is because I have never met a leader at any level of an organization who has said, I wouldn't benefit from being more curious. Every single one recognizes that the speed at which they're having to make decisions, and they know they're
yeah,
making it with imperfect information. We're never going to get to full knowledge because that just is not possible. However, they would all say, and they all do say, I could be more curious. Let's work on being more curious. And so when I get a chance to encounter a generation of people that I do not understand for a variety of reasons, this is a wonderful turn of phrase to focus us on being curious. In this case, let me be fascinated without judgment instead of just going
yeah,
to that place of frustration.
yeah,
So I think that's
yeah.
a wonderful phrase. You might say it's cheesy. I'm going to say it's memorable. And that's good.
It's a far better word, and it helps my self-esteem when you say that. So Tim, let me volley back real quick with some research. When I was interviewing representatives from all 5 of the generations that are still at work, I asked these reps from each generation, what do you want most from other generations when they interact with you? Well, we got a truckload of answers, you can imagine, from
Mhm.
Gen Z to boomers and builders. But 3 answers came up in every generation. Number one, they said, would you approach me with humility? Which communicates, I don't know everything. I could probably pick up something here,
Mhm.
22-year-old or
Mhm.
62-year-old, as I interface with you. So humility was number one. Number two is predictable, but it's the word respect. I think far too often my older generation says to young team members, well, you got to earn my respect, Sonny, and they're begging for respect when they start. Don't make me earn it. Make me glad you hired me
Mhm.
by believing me. So one of our core values at our office, at our team, is begin with belief. As I interact, I'm going to start by believing you, even before you may have earned it, but that's probably going to foster you earning it. So, okay, so word number one is humility. Word number two is belief. But the third word you're going to love, curiosity. They all said, would you approach me curious about who I am and what I might say or do that could benefit everybody? Well, that's just screaming for esteem, really.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I'm not a psychologist. My doctorate's in leadership, but oh my gosh, think about a workplace. Humility, respect, and curiosity with all interchanges all time. That would be fascinating.
That would be a remarkable place to be. And I can't think of one of us that wouldn't want to be at a place like that. I cannot think of one of us.
Since we've yet to define the generations here in this conversation, I think question one ought to be, listeners, uh, find out their story. The reason different generations respond differently is not just we're different ages. That does affect us.
Yeah.
I get a little more tired quicker now than I did 40 years ago. But we are shaped in the first couple of decades of our life, the 20 to 25 years of our life. In fact, our brains develop a little bit like wet cement. Our neural pathways are very pliable, very plastic in the first 20 years of our life. And then it's not that they're hardened later and you cannot change at 30 or 35, but change becomes measurably harder later. In other words, it's easy to change as a 16-year-old, a little bit harder as a 46-year-old. Because of that, I remember being shaped in the 60s and 70s by the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, the OPEC gas crisis, the tensions that were in the air. My mom and dad, my gosh, Great Depression kids, World War II kids. My dad was born in 1930. He's a builder generation guy. They were called builders because they built so much out of so little. The first decade of his life was the Great Depression. The next 5 years, World War II.
Yeah.
So he's frugal, resourceful, grateful. Oh my gosh. So the whole mantra there was just be grateful you have a job. The mantra of my generation it was Boomer Xer. And it was just so different because it was post World War II. The builder generation would be born 1930 to 1945, 1929 and 1945. Started with the stock market crash and the Great Depression all the way to the end of World War II. Those were the markers, and they were called the builders because they built so much out of so little. Right after World War II, a new generation starts. Baby Boomer was the name of the new generation because the boom of babies started 9 months after World War II was over. And that lasted for 18 years, 1946 to 64. The end of the boomer generation happened with the public introduction of the birth control pill. Right around the mid-1960s, the baby buster generation started. It was a bust, not a boom. They were eventually called Generation X because of their demand. The times were just different than the big post-World War II, we're the most awesome country in the world. Then in the 80s and 90s, you have the millennial generation. We have been throwing them under the bus for 15 years now. But
That's true.
80s and 90s kids would be my own kids, Bethany and Jonathan.
Okay.
Bethany is 35, Jonathan's 31 now. They're both millennials. And by the way, the millennials are called that title because they'll spend their entire adult life in the new millennium, the 21st century. They were born in the 20th, but will enjoy mostly the 21st century. And then right around the turn of the century comes the Generation Z following Generation Y or the millennials.
Yep.
And they really only remember the last 20 plus years where life has been a little darker. It started with, in many ways, the dot-com era bubble bursting. So we thought the internet would be awesome forever. Well, then we saw the not so awesome parts, right? And then there was September 11th, 2001. We'd never seen anything like that. And they don't remember that, but they're in the aftermath of that where we're all a little more anxious,
Yep.
a little more scared.
Yep.
Maybe we're not so invincible. And then you have the introduction of the smartphone. You have the first Black president elected, changes in the air. But there have been more mass shootings this year than we've had days in the year. So, I mean, we've had, if we were at the end of the year, there would be more mass shootings than days in the year.
That's
so
unreal.
think about being a teenager today. They're soon to be hired full time in the job about whenever they turn 22. But I'm telling you, it's been a little more anxious, a little bit more depression. We hear about mental health issues all the time, do we not? It's been so fascinating to do the social science on these 5 generations. Each one of them doesn't represent psychology. There's introverts and extroverts, pessimists and optimists in every generation.
Yeah.
But there's a tone to culture. It's sociology. The builder generation was a generation of caution. The baby boomer generation, a generation of confidence. Xers, back to caution. Millennials, back to confidence. Gen Z, back to caution. It's like a pendulum swinging back and forth on the grandfather clock of history. And it's all tone. It's tone. So you got a really cool, goofy Gen Zer, but inside of that young man or young woman, it's a percolating crock pot or coffee pot of angst and uncertainty. And, God knows what's going to happen next. And that's kind of how the tone of culture is right now.
Wow, that's fascinating. That is a wonderful segue to the next part that I want us to spend a little time on, because there are those trends, and the idea of caution, confidence, caution is fascinating to think about. And yet each person is an individual. And so how do we take all of that into account as we interact amongst the generations without being too much, without leaning too much into stereotyping, which can at times get us in trouble? We pigeonhole people. We say, oh, you're that generation, you're that way. It's like, well, actually, that might be a millennial who looks a whole lot more like a Gen Xer. And so how do we take this information and use it wisely, but also be careful not to go too far with it, if I could put it that way?
Well, I would just say, first of all, my goal in the book is not to stereotype, but to understand. So when I interview a Gen Z college grad, just knowing there might be a bit of angst inside, even if he's an optimist, even if he's zany on TikTok or whatever, I know inside might be some mental health issues he's covering up in his TikTok videos.
Okay.
That's helpful. So when you interview a Gen Zer, there's 2 major meta qualities that employers are saying, I see these all the time, and they're oxymoronic. So a high sense of agency and a high sense of anxiety, and both are coexisting at the same time. So the agency might be, because I grew up with a smartphone, I think I know a lot, maybe more than you do, boss. You go, no, you don't, Bob. I think many employers, well, I know many HR hiring managers have said, my God, they're coming in with such audacity and almost like cockiness, So just know this can be channeled in the right direction. But here's the oxymoronic part, or the paradox of it all. They also come in with a high sense of anxiety, also fostered by the smartphone.
Yes.
So think about it. The overwhelming information I have at 12 or 16, I'm not even ready for all that. We need to lead them knowing that about their life. That just makes us better leaders who have greater understanding. And I think they're going to lean in and stick around because they feel like, I've got a manager who understands me. So that's my goal. We can stereotype. Stereotypes are mental shortcuts that are not helpful. We do not need to take mental shortcuts. We do need to do a broad sweep and say, ooh, I need to be aware. Maybe this young man or young woman might be struggling a little bit with maybe panic attacks, or at least when they happen, I'm not shocked.
Yeah, well, and that pulls us back to the curiosity that we were talking about earlier. I'm going to be informed about the general trends, but I'm not going to stop there. I'm now going to extend my curiosity to see, well, maybe this is a very different person in that generation, and maybe they're free from some of those things, or at least, to your point, maybe I won't be surprised if they show up later on. Your comment about how the smartphone comes into play here is just, it's interesting. We as a family sat down and watched the Social Dilemma, and I'm sure many people out there have seen that. It's kind of a shocking documentary if you haven't seen it before, about kind of how these technologies work. But it reminds me to one of your other books, Artificial Maturity, where you talk about this fast forwarding, not because we're actually are mature, but because we've been more exposed. And so that's what I hear as you talk about the smartphone here.
That's exactly right. And for listeners, if you've never heard that term, I don't blame you, but it's a term that I've used because it describes not the kids are not the culprits; they're the victims of this day we live in. So kids today are overexposed to information far earlier than they're ready, but underexposed to firsthand experiences later than they're ready.
Wow.
So, when I was growing up, man, I was doing a paper route at 12.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that makes me saintly. I'm just saying I got work experience early on. Well, parents are keeping their kids sometimes out of work because academics are so important or volleyball's important. All those are good. But boy, nothing other than firsthand experience really gives me wisdom. I can watch 12 or 20 YouTube videos and think I know everything and I got the world by the tail. No, you don't. You've watched videos.
And I think, you got a variety of different industries that listen in on the podcast. And many of them are dealing with very young people in their ranks, and wanting to understand, needing to understand those better is really critical. And something you said triggered another thought from me. Simon Sinek has a great little clip where he explains this idea, and I won't put it in the exact same words as you and Simon, but ultimately the generational trends exist for a reason. They happen to the generation. And
Yes.
when we start to look at that, I think, and this was Simon's point, we can be more open to empathy, especially with younger people, and it would apply older as well, that we don't quite understand. If we can wrap our minds around the idea that there are a series of things that have happened to people collectively as a group that push them perhaps in a direction that we don't understand or maybe don't even agree with. But can we keep in mind that in all likelihood, the difficult employee probably didn't wake up this morning and say, how can I be a punk at work? How can I achieve that? I'm not absolving them of responsibility, because we all have to take, okay, this is the hand I was dealt and now I have to play it. But I am saying, and kind of mimicking off of what Simon was saying, is can we bring some empathy to
Yeah.
the equation, understanding this next generation never knew that there wasn't an internet and never didn't have a smartphone in their hands. That has impact and implication. And can we just slow our judgment down a little bit as the old fogey leaders and be curious and show up with some, wow, you know what? Maybe if I'd grown up in your generation, maybe I'd be worse than you are. If somebody's viewing them negatively in that case, if I'm not looking at the positives that they bring and I'm in that space. Anyway, so I hear in what you're saying the opportunity to empathize and connect and understand that there are these trends that have happened to people.
Well, Tim, let me give you the steps I'm walking through now with my younger team members. And what I teach leaders to use when we feel the same amount of frustration, they're not getting it, what's wrong. So you know how we've used the phrase forever, never, never. This is a leg you got to stand on, ALEG. It's an acronym, okay? So the letter A is ask, don't tell. Ask questions. So I need to start not with an accusation or what the heck are you thinking? So, and by the way, sometimes I need to ask questions because I, honest to Pete, don't understand why they just did that. So I might even say, tell me what your thinking was when you made that decision or when you made that move. When I ask questions, this is just fundamental behavioral science. When I ask questions, they feel important. I'm not telling, that's me being important. I'm asking, that's them feeling important. The letter L is listen well. So once I ask questions, it does little good unless I actually stop to listen. I'm not just waiting for my turn. So when I listen well, they feel heard. And that is the cry of Generation Z. I want to feel heard. And it might feel like fingernails on a chalkboard to a 55 or older employer, but I'm telling you, they need to feel heard. You'll get to your goal faster if they feel heard. Here's what I'd say at my team. Everybody has a voice. Not everybody has a vote, but everybody has a voice. Okay, so A is ask questions. L is listen well. The letter E is empathize. So if I listen well, and then I'm able with verbal, nonverbal, and paraverbal cues to let them know I understand. When I empathize, they feel understood. And I'm just saying it's just huge. You know what I'm thinking right now, Tim? David Augsburger, a great author and I believe a psychologist, but David said it first. Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they're indistinguishable. Well, and think about you and I as dads with young children or
Goodness.
even young adult children. Oh my gosh. When I stop and listen to my daughter, who is 35 and we don't think exactly alike, can I say that here? For her to know that I'm speaking to her as if I believe I'm right, but I'm listening to her as if I believe I'm wrong, it's a game changer. It's just a game changer. So the letter G in A leg is now I can guide. I've earned my right after asking and listening and empathizing. Now they're going, okay, your turn to volley back on the tennis court here. And now I've maybe earned some moments to say, can I tell you what I think maybe why that didn't go right, 10 minutes ago? And I've got a voice then. So it's not using your badge to get your way. It's using your empathy to get your way.
There's so many, like when you add these things up, I want you to think about, and by you, I'm saying all of us here, I want us to think about what happens to relationships, because that's what leadership is. It's a relationship between
Yeah.
the leader and the person that is being led. But what happens to relationships when you go through a process, this A-leg process? We get the opportunity to guide at the end, but when it comes to the last piece there, just before you're talking about empathy and empathizing, I think that communicates that you matter. When your emotions matter so much that I want to connect with those emotions, then I think you're fundamentally saying you matter. So if you think about those first three pieces, the net result of asking, listening well, and empathizing is communicating to the person you're valuable, you're heard, and you matter.
Yeah.
Now, you
Yeah.
tell me, what happens to relationships when we live our life in such a way that we
Yeah.
communicate with our actions and our words, you're valuable, you're heard, and you matter? That's what's going to buy us the leverage to be able to hold people accountable in a healthy way. That's going to allow us to deliver the difficult messages in a way that's productive and constructive. That's going to allow us to help people thrive instead of just surviving. And it just so many, I just think about those three things. And of course, I get a chance to guide if I'm first coming with you're valuable, you're heard, and you matter.
This is so powerful. When you look at the different generations, 96% of who we are, we have in common. Now, there's 4% that we have found and we get mad at or glad at or whatever, depending on who it is. But we need to start there and say we have a ton of in common, whether you're 22, 42, or 62, and we need to find those. But here's the 4%. You add something to our team that I don't have unless I've got it, maybe perhaps a 20-something or a 30-something or 40-something. So we have 4 generations on staff at Growing Leaders. I'm taking advantage of all of it in a good way,
Yeah.
And they're feeling valued because they've got something I don't have.
Yeah.
We're doing reverse mentoring all the time where both generations are mentoring each other in what we bring to the table. And it's been awesome. It really has.
I want to wrap up with the super practical side. I love to spend time in the theory and the ideas because that's what makes things portable. I can go from context to context when I understand the principle and the idea. However, everybody loves the very practical application idea. So let's talk about a couple of ideas of some activities that could be done to help close generational gaps on teams.
Well, the first one might be the simplest that I'm thinking of right now. If I were to put a title to it, I simply call it Ditch the Niche. So we find ourselves in niches when we gather around. Boomers are together, or boomers and Xers are together. Millennials and Gen Z are together. So we got to ditch the niche and put the 20-somethings, 30-somethings with the 40-somethings and 50-somethings on purpose. Just maybe maybe on a team that's going to think about marketing, or how do we sell this new product, or how do we go to market with this new product? How would we reach your demographic? How about mine? So I just did that with my newest book. I asked all four generations, how would you market to your generation with this new product? So that's one. But Tim, I mentioned earlier the term reverse mentoring. I love this action, and I think I can describe it quickly. Reverse mentoring is when you specifically have a seasoned veteran and a young rookie, perhaps, get together for learning. But both are going to mentor and both are going to be a mentee. So the first thing you do is you swap stories. We always have something in common. We find something in common when we swap stories. But then the older obviously pours into the younger in how to succeed in this workplace. We've got a few years under my belt here. But then they switch hats, and the younger might mentor the older and say, here's the newest app I just got. I think we could use this here,
Mm,
for
yeah.
monetizing or whatever. And I even tell stories in the book about Tony, who found a way to use TikTok to reach 2 million other people in his workplace. So I really recommend doing that. But that means we have to come to the table with humility, respect, and curiosity. And when we do that, it's fascinating. I do this with two of my team members specifically. One is 30 years younger than me. One is 40 years younger than me. And I love every minute of what I learn.
Those are remarkably simple application points. And I love the title. Both of those titles are sticky: Ditch the Niche and Reverse Mentoring. And I see freedom actually in being able to show up with somebody much more younger. The freedom in, hey, I'm here to learn, as opposed to I've got to have it all figured out for you and I got to have the perfect coaching. We'll do that. I'll share with you what I know. But I just sense that there's the opportunity to feel a sense of kind of wonder and learning to be able to go into those relationships in that way. What's a story that you have related to all that we've been talking about that would be great for us to kind of walk away with in our mind today?
Tim, we've talked today, and it just kind of happened about really understanding each other, understanding our people if we're leaders. And I don't know if there's a more vivid illustration of this than something that happened in April of 1945, of all places and times. But it was in that month that our president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, passed away. If you remember, he'd been elected 4 times, which has never happened before and never happened since. But he led us through the Great Depression, through World War II. And it was just, it was one of the toughest times in America's history. And he led us through all of that. So you can imagine when he passed away, the streets of Washington, D.C. were just lined with people who wanted to pay their respects to the president. And as his casket was driven slowly down the street, thousands and thousands of people were seen either saluting or wiping tears from their eyes at this crossing. But one particular individual, as a man, and this is remarkable that it was a male, not a female, just started sobbing. He's weeping. And he wept so violently that he fell to his knees. A gentleman right next to him felt kind of bad for him because here's this guy on his knees on the sidewalk and making a scene. So this gentleman picked up the weeping man back to his feet. And as he did so, he just wanted to make some conversation. So he simply said, "Oh, did you know the president?" I love the man's response, the weeping man's response. He simply said, "No, but he knew me.
Mm.
He knew me." And I think, oh, if all of my people would feel that way about my leadership when I lead them.
So as we wrap up the episode with Dr. Tim Elmore, there's a few things that I want to draw some emphasis to. And one of them, as we talked about that set of three there, this idea of humility, of belief/respect, and curiosity. You see just how critical it is. What are the commonalities between the generations? What do we want in the leaders that we follow? we want qualities that are about who they are. And you've heard it on this podcast before. The research says that 77% of our effectiveness as leaders comes from who we are, not what we do. And certainly that list of 3 that was consistent between the various generations points to just how important it is for us to be well-developed human beings if we are going to reach our potential as leaders. But as we wrap up, I want to put a little special emphasis on one of those 3 today, and that is the one of curiosity. One of the things that we often discuss with our clients around this issue of being curious is a simple idea that goes like this. When something doesn't make sense, there's something I don't know. When something doesn't make sense, there's something I don't know. Rather than vilifying and judging the other person, can we come at it with the perspective that if it doesn't make sense to me, there's likely something very important that I don't know. And that can cause us then to show up in a much more curious fashion. Not the Spanish Inquisition, I'm going to pin you up against the wall type of curiosity. That's not really curiosity, but genuinely, I want to understand better something that I don't get, which leads us to this idea around trading frustration for fascination. I love that little turn of phrase. I think it's so important and such a guiding idea for us as leaders to really apply, regardless of whether you're talking about generations or personality styles or really anything. Can we make a commitment that when we feel frustration bubbling up, that it's a cue for us to get fascinated, to be curious, to wonder, and to wade into that space with openness and interest, not condemnation or judgment. And so that leads me to the question I want to leave you with today. And that is this. Are you as a leader willing to trade your frustration for fascination? I'm Tim Spiker, reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you receive your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your friends and colleagues. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.